the transportation work. I lead the transportation work for the committee, and I also lead the environmental review, the National Environmental Policy Act portfolio for the committee. And that has been a pretty great space to work for the last couple of years. We've gotten a huge amount done that I can talk a little bit about. Let me just start though with kind of where I came from to get here. I worked after I graduated after I was sort of in your shoes. I left University of Chicago, and I lived in Japan for a couple of years. I hadn't done a study abroad while I was in undergrad, and had sort of felt like I'd missed the boat a little bit on that. So I got a position where I was being paid to live abroad, which seemed like a better deal since I was fairly broke as an undergrad. And I was teaching in Japan for a couple of years, and then I wanted to move into policy work, but wasn't quite sure how to make that jump. So I applied to grad schools. I went to Georgetown for a master's in public policy in 2008, and it was a great time to come to DC because everyone was very excited about Barack Obama's election, and the idea of being a policy person was very very exciting. So so I came to DC and studied for 2 years at Georgetown, and then got I had the chance to be a presidential management fellow, which enabled me to, it's basically like a fast track into working in the federal government and at agencies. It can be a little challenging sometimes to get through the hiring process in federal agencies. And so the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, for a small number of people who are able to kind of get through that screening process, you can get a much easier path to being hired. So I went to work at the Department of Transportation, and I worked there for about 6 years working on environmental policy and livability and bike policy and climate policy at the Department of Transportation. I worked in the Office of the Secretary and in the policy office there. And one of the most exciting things that I did in my time there was work on a reauthorization proposal. Basically, the transportation programs are authorized by Congress every 5 to 7 years, and the programs have funding for that entire period. Unlike many programs that have an annual appropriations process, transportation programs, sometimes some of them get annual appropriations, but many of them have multi-year funding, and that gets authorized by the authorizing committee, which for the highway program is the Environment and Public Works Committee. So when I was at the Department of Transportation, I worked on an authorizing proposal for the highway and transit programs that would have changed. It proposed changes from the administration to Congress. It proposed changes for how transportation assets are planned, how the environmental review is completed, how they are funded. All sorts of changes were proposed, and that was like working on legislation. A legislative proposal was just incredibly exciting, and it felt like learning a new language. Like the ideas sort of opened up as I worked on that, and I knew I wanted to keep working in that type of work. So I got the opportunity a few years later to move to the Senate, and I worked for Tom Carper, who is the senator from Delaware. I worked in his personal office. It was already clear that he would become the next either chair or ranking member of the Environment and Public Works Committee, because the current ranking member, Barbara Boxer, had announced her retirement. So sort of you're able to play the moving the deck chairs around game, and I knew that he would be next in line. So I knew that he would be a good boss to have in order to move to the committee, because the committees are really where the law is written. At the end of the day, individual offices, personal offices in the House and Senate write bills. But when people talk about considering a bill in regular order, that means having the committee weigh in, and in many cases, amend or write from the start, write a new bill. And certainly with the transportation programs, that is how they are written. So last Congress rather, the transportation programs needed to be reauthorized, and I was the lead drafter for the highway programs that ended up forming the basis of the infrastructure bill that was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was passed in November of 2021. And that was a pretty incredible experience, exhausting, but definitely exhilarating. And then the next year in 2022, we had additional programs in the Inflation Reduction Act. So I was the lead drafter for the transportation programs and the environmental review programs that were included in that bill, in that law as well. This year, some of the main things that we are working on are in the permitting space. I'm the permitting lead for the committee, and we're trying to figure out how to engage constructively in that conversation and develop legislation that would still protect critical environmental resources and not undermine our environmental laws, yet would enable a faster deployment of renewable energy and transmission lines to facilitate a cleaner economy. So that's the main thing that I'm working on right now. Let me just pause. Are there any questions before I can keep talking? But it'd probably be more fun if it was interactive. Okay.
Can you hear me? I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, I'm not sure if you can hear me. The mic's not working very well. Oh,
I can.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your process as you're sort of like developing these policies. What's sort of the process that you go through?
Yeah, it can really vary depending on the topic. And in some spaces, there is a more defined kind of field of ideas from which to draw. And in other spaces, there's more of a vacuum and lack of any good ideas. So certainly when I was reauthorizing the transportation program, there are many stakeholders who are really vested stakeholders in the existing structure of the transportation program, from the state departments of transportation and road building, construction companies, trucking companies, so private sector, and then the local agencies and planning organizations that are sort of coming up with the projects that ultimately get funded. So in that space, my first step was to kind of solicit ideas from those communities and from advocacy communities as well. There's really hardworking, they're lobbyists, but for bike safety, or for the Rails to Trails program and things like that. So we did a series of stakeholder listening sessions to hear from a wide range of people who have views on the transportation programs and views about changes that are needed. We also spent a long time, thinking about those suggestions, and many times they were at odds. The suggestions we would hear from industry were at odds with the suggestions we would hear from, the safety community or the environmental non-governmental organizations. And we function as sort of a screen. The committee staff, we function as a screen of those ideas and ultimately have to determine, both as a policy matter, what makes sense within within the existing programs, and like what's the right way for the federal agencies, the Federal Highway Administration, to proceed with regard to a given policy. And we also have to consider the politics of whether we would be able to get a bill that was going to be passed with 60 votes if it was included too many, environmental streamlining provisions, or it included too many requirements on states to, curtail spending on new capacity projects versus maintenance of existing roads. So there's always a balance of policy views and also politics that comes into it. Again, like I said, that sort of in the transportation world, it's a little bit more established. We do reauthorizations every 5 to 7 years. And so there's like a very active sort of industry focus, but transportation stakeholder community. The permitting world, I find, is quite different. There's a lot of high level agreement that environmental reviews take too long or aren't useful enough. And then there's also concern that communities don't have an ample enough opportunity to weigh in on projects that will affect their community. There's sort of a surprising lack of real ideas that would be effective, in my mind, for making any changes in that space. And that has required a really different legislative approach for me. I'm now spending much more time kind of reading research reports that have been pulled together by different, the Aspen Institute did a report on, potential changes that we could do to make to environmental review processes. And some of them are really big ideas that are difficult to implement as a matter of law. And part of the challenge in this space, in the environmental review space, is that the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, it's a 6-page long law, basically. It's most of the implementation of that law, it has been accomplished through regulations and guidance and through case law. And so it's very difficult in that situation to legislate changes that are really more matter of agency practice or case law. It's also much more difficult to know with certainty how any given change will affect end outcomes that we're looking for on timelines and environmental quality, et cetera. So it can really vary just depending on the type of the field that you're working in. But in general, I would say the ideas, like I have a lot of ideas. That's sort of what is appealing to me about this role. And I listen a lot to people who are smarter than me and who work in the agencies that are already implementing the laws as they currently stand. And I listen for what's going well and what's not going well. And then I hear a lot from external advocates.
All right, thank you. I had one other question that came up early. Could you talk a little bit more about the work that you did on transportation with the Inflation Reduction Act?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. The work that I do on transportation and what?
With the Inflation Reduction Act.
Oh, sure. Yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act was really fun because I'm a Democrat and we were negotiating with Democrats for that one. So it was a great time. We developed a number of programs that were considered. We worked with our House counterparts. So I work on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. In the House, the transportation programs are the jurisdiction of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And so I worked with the staff there, who worked for the Chairman DeFazio at the time. And we had a program that we felt like if we are going to be working in a Democrat-only bill, let's work on things that we would never be able to accomplish in a bipartisan bill. And for us, that was primarily two pieces. First was climate change. We did create a few climate-focused programs in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but it was not. There was a lot that was left on the cutting room floor, as it goes. So we worked for a long time on a climate-focused program that would have directed the Department of Transportation to require states to measure their emissions and to make plans to reduce emissions. It would have had eligibility only for climate mitigating infrastructure, bike lanes, and zero emission vehicle charging and purchases. So we worked on that. Was one major piece. It had a large focus on funding for cities and counties versus for states. And then the other piece that we worked on, which again, we did a small amount in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but by and large, we're not able to accomplish as much as we would have liked. And that was on equity. We created a large program. It's called the Neighborhood Access and Equity Program. And this was modeled loosely on the Reconnecting Communities pilot that I'd created for the bipartisan infrastructure law. But it was sort of broader than I had worked for a really long time on reconnecting communities work. That was something that I'd become really interested in when I worked at Department of Transportation with Secretary Fox, who was a great sort of had a great bully pulpit to speak about equity and cities that were impacted by the effect of highways being built right through them in America. And so I created a program that was included in the infrastructure bill that would enable cities to either remove those highways or mitigate that kind of that disconnectedness through pedestrian and bike access or underpasses or caps over a below grade highway. So that was we were able to get that into the bipartisan infrastructure law, but I wanted to go further in reconciliation. So we created a program that included all of those eligibilities, but also included things like sound walls and wetlands mitigation and work that really looked at every aspect of negative impact of highways, of which there are many, air quality impacts and noise impacts and water impacts, and as well as like impact to communities, and provided eligibility in discretionary grants for mitigating any of those types of impacts. So that in the end, and we also then created a program for environmental review, so just to provide the agencies with more funding to complete environmental reviews, just in light of the really significant increase in funding for new projects. We wanted to make sure that the projects were being reviewed and built out, and that the funding wouldn't go unspent. And we were also looking for ways to reduce emissions. And one really major driver of emissions is actually technically in the industrial sector, but the cement and steel that's ultimately used for transportation projects, that gets counted as industrial sector emissions, but of course it really, in a way is transportation emissions. And so we created a program that would provide incentives for builders of federally funded roadways to use materials that were lower emission materials, lower emission cement or steel, essentially. So those were the main things that we worked on. We had a few other ideas that kind of dropped by the wayside for one reason or another. And those were the ideas that kind of lasted until the very end. And then sort of in the week before the reconciliation, the Inflation Reduction Act, if you were following it last year, was sort of dead, and then it was alive, and then it was dead, and then it was alive, and it was just like went back and forth. We were working really hard with the Senator Manchin's team to get them okay with all of the provisions, and ultimately they were concerned about the climate language, and that fell out at the very last minute and was not included in the final bill. that was enacted. But the neighborhood access program was included, and the low emission materials program was included, and the environmental review fund. So I was really excited for the things that were included, and as you can tell, still a little bit bitter about the things that got left out.
Okay. Very understandable. All right, so taking a little bit of a pivot here to sort of go back to your career journey and how you got to where you are now. What advice would you give students who are maybe looking to go into a similar field, working on policy or government work on environmental issues? What sort of advice would you give to students looking to it?
Well, with regard to working on policy, I mean, I think you can get really valuable policy experience and knowledge in any location. If you're really focused on federal policy, it probably is helpful to work either in a congressional office that is a regional office, or to come to DC. And every House member and senator has offices throughout the country, and so it's certainly possible to begin working in Congress without living in DC. But ultimately, I think the federal agencies and the work on policy that is done in Congress really does happen here in DC. So DC is a great place to live also. So I love it here, and I'm raising a family here, and it's just especially beautiful this time of year. So I would certainly advise you to come up with a plan that brings you to DC eventually. I think that it's helpful to really know why you want to work in policy. Or why you want to work in Congress. It's very cool to walk the hallways and see, senators just walking around, or like be in a meeting with Chuck Schumer. But it's sort of not a good enough reason to want to pursue it. And having some policy goals that you really care deeply about are both important for making it clear to whoever's in the position of interviewing you, why this means something to you, that you have something you want to achieve. And it's also helpful just to kind of, as a touchstone for yourself, for when, it can be a challenging work-life balance, and it can be just a challenging experience in general. There's a lot of frustration working in Congress. And so it can be helpful just to remind yourself of like what it is that you want to accomplish, that you really only can accomplish here in this role. So I would say that that's helpful. With regard to like ultimately working in the Senate or in the House of Representatives, the best way to get a job in policy in the Senate or House, I think, really is to have another job in the House or Senate, and then kind of be hired up to a more senior role that is more policy focused. And by and large, in our personal office, Tom Carper's personal office, the legislative assistants, many of them are hired from the legislative correspondents, who are hired from staff assistants. You can move up, and many of the staff assistants are hired from the intern pool. And so finding ways to be in an office is not only a way to learn who it is that will be making the hiring decisions and like have them know you, but also you hear about the jobs earlier because when someone's leaving, and so you have the opportunity to apply for those roles. There's a certain amount of there's a certain amount which you can only really learn how Congress works by working in Congress. I did work in an agency for my first sort of 6 years of 7 years or maybe of my professional career, and I found that to be really valuable. The federal agencies just have tremendous knowledge and their staff. And so you learn a huge amount from the more senior staff who you're working with. And you also, there are a lot of training opportunities for federal employees that you're able to take advantage of. And you end up able to really have a depth of knowledge that is very difficult to gain on the Hill. So in some ways, for more senior roles, it can be valuable to have experience outside of Congress. Like, for instance, when I was worked at the Department of Transportation, and then when I was hired to the personal office in the Senate for Tom Carper, I was, hired as his transportation LA, legislative assistant. But my portfolio included transportation, which, I really had just focused on highways and transit in my career at Department of Transportation. So when I came here, we were actually focusing on an aviation bill, which I really knew very little about. So not only every mode of transportation, but I also was lead for water infrastructure and for toxics and pensions and labor policy. So, and that's pretty typical for Senate offices, that you have a really wide range of portfolio. Okay, thank you, Annabelle. And that's actually in the House, that's even more so the case. Like, the portfolios much broader. So that is really valuable to you as a person for developing your knowledge, but it can be difficult to go really deep on one specific topic if you want to just be an expert in, housing policy, for instance. So I think that there's a variety of pathways, but kind of getting to DC and getting just like into place so that you are able to jump into these roles is probably the most important thing.
All right. And I also wanted to know sort of, how would you say your education experience, when you were undergrad at Chicago, and then you went to grad school at Georgetown, how would you say that education sort of shaped or impacts your current work?
Well, I think that it enabled me to qualify for the role. I'm sure that the coursework was valuable also. Looking back, I'm not sure. There's this great course, the Little Red Schoolhouse course on writing. I strongly recommend that one for improving your writing ability. And I would say that that's probably not just that course, but in general, learning to be able to process information quickly and synthesize it, and produce high quality writing. It was a huge thing that I gained in my coursework at Chicago and my graduate degree. Getting a graduate degree at Georgetown really was focused on statistics and economics, which I was a sociology undergrad, so I had done quite a bit of statistics work there. And I still take some pride in being able to read papers and understand the methods or the data, but honestly, it's not something that I use in my day-to-day personally. I have a number of friends from grad school who do, but that's not the focus. Honestly, in retrospect, probably a law degree would have been more useful for my current career, just because I end up working so much in the US code and writing legislation and amending code. So that was not as much a focus for me in a master's of public policy. The public policy degree that I got, and I think most of them are more focused on kind of program administration, program structure, which is valuable to me because I have created a number of programs in legislation. But so I'm probably not being fair. It's probably more impactful than I think, but it's hard to discern the precise pieces that were particularly useful.
Understandable. I've also heard very good things about the Red Schoolhouse course. So Seems like it might be a good idea to try and take it. And then I sort of wanted to know if there was any experience that you would consider like essential to your career path and sort of like where you went.
I think that all of it has been like essential. Like one step has led to the next pretty clearly for me. I haven't switched jobs as often as some do. I've preferred to sort of stay in a position and really go deep in that role. And so I mean I don't think that there have been programs that I worked on that are less consequential, but like by and large I would say it's all been kind of really built that there's been a very logical sort of step forward for me. And I think that that's probably often the case though. Each step that you take kind of leads to the next one in a way that wouldn't be possible without having taken the prior step.
And then last thing I want to know is if you know of any specific programs or internships for students in the area that might be good for them to look into to get some experience.
Yeah, for undergraduates, the Truman Fellowship is a great program. That's something that you have to be nominated while you are an undergrad. I think that the undergrad, the college has to nominate you. But I worked with a number of Truman Fellows when I was at the Department of Transportation, and they were really, really smart and capable, and they were given very advanced projects to lead, even though they were, just 22 or so. They were right out of undergrad. So that's something that I would look into. The Presidential Management Fellowship that I mentioned was really great. That's for when you've graduated from a master's degree or law school. And that again can just like launch a career in the federal government. That's a really great way to get hired. In general, though, even without those fellowships, right now is a great time to look at agencies, especially if you're interested in transportation and climate, because the amount of funding that we provided through the infrastructure law and through the Inflation Reduction Act is just like incredible increases in resources at the agencies, and they're looking for, they're sort of desperate for people to come on board and help implement those new programs and get those dollars out to localities. So and some agencies have special hiring authority that enables it makes it easier for them to hire new staff. So I would strongly recommend looking at it's not even internships. It would just be a junior level position as an analyst or economist or what have you in departments of like transportation or HUD or EPA. All of them have additional resources and need for bright young staff.
Great, thank you so much. Any last questions? Just to make sure. Okay, I think that's it then on our end. Do you have any last comments that you have?
No, thanks so much for the chance to chat with you all. Good luck.
Thank you so much.